Hey everybody, real quick, before we get into the Season 2 recap, if you need a recap of Perry Mason Season 1, hit the tab in the upper right-hand corner. It'll take you right to it. Season 2 kicks off a few months after Season 1 left off. Perry Mason is now a lawyer, he's running his own firm, but he's no longer doing criminal law. He's doing civil law, but he's bored out of his mind. Della was really the one who convinced him to do it because it helps him pay the bills, so much so that he has a new secretary, Marion, although Perry does think it's a waste of money. His big client at the moment is a guy named Sonny Grice, who runs a local market. He's suing an ex-employee because he feels like the employee has ripped off his entire model. It's a nice payday for Perry, but just like everything else, he's having a tough time getting into it because he's really focused on his last client. He can't shake the Emily Dodson case. It's a name that put him in the paper, it got him a lot of publicity, it probably got him most of his clients, but it's also a case that he thinks about just about every day. He's especially thrown off when Pete ends up getting the medical examiner's report of the cause of death for Emily Dodson because she killed herself. Suicide by drowning is the official cause of death. Emily was found floating face down in the river, and it's something that Perry just feels guilty about. Even though Emily won the case, she couldn't live without her son, and it was just too much for her. To get his mind off of things, Perry ends up taking a motorcycle that he won from a client out for a drive, but he ends up crashing it and scraping up his knee pretty good. And it's noticeable the next day when he comes to court that he is bleeding. But he still ultimately has a job to do to cross-examine Ed Pertel, Sonny Grice's former employee. The defendant's lawyer puts up a pretty good fight. He makes the case that his client came up with a lot of the things that Sonny is currently using, but Perry's just a little bit better. He points out that, yes, while it might be true that Ed did come up with these ideas, he did so under the umbrella of Sonny. He was a hired, paid employee by Sonny Grice, therefore, he can't just take these ideas and create his own thing. He then pulls out a pretty damning photo for Pertel that all but cinches the case for Sonny Grice. Although when they get out of the court, Della isn't too happy with the way that Perry handled himself. They also have a meeting with a future client that Perry has no interest in going to, so Della has to go it on her own. And like many civil cases, it's a pretty boring topic, but it's not a complete loss for Della. It looks like they are going to take this client on, but also she catches the eye of a female. They end up running into each other in the bathroom. Her name is Anita St. Pierre, and she is very direct. She suggests that the two get out of there, but Della can't. She can't just leave this client sitting there. So Anita gives her card and says, give me a call. While Della was at this meeting, Perry went to go thank one of the people that helped him all but win this case, Paul Drake. It was Drake who was the one that got those photos for Perry. Ever since Drake left the police force, he's been working for Perry. But with civil suits, there isn't much work to go around. Perry does feel really guilty about this. He shows up at Paul's birthday party and apologizes for the lack of work. But Paul, being a really proud guy, doesn't take Perry's money when he offers it because he wants to earn it. He kind of takes offense to it, to be honest. Either way, when Perry leaves, he thinks there's got to be a way to get Paul more money and more work. And he starts thinking about ways to do that. The next day, though, he gets great news. Thanks to Paul's hard work, the defense wants to reach a plea deal. They go to give Sonny Grice the good news, but Sonny Grice is a killer. He doesn't just want to win this case, he wants to ruin Ed Pertel. And both Perry and Della try to talk him out of it because there's just no need for it, but Sonny Grice is just a real son of a bitch. And he tells them that if they're not willing to take this thing to a verdict, which he knows he'll win, then he'll find somebody who will. So in order to pay the bills, they unfortunately have to do something that they don't want. Ruin a guy's life. What Sonny really wants to do is have Ed Pertel hand over his store. The thing that he worked his entire life for. His family's life savings has gone into this store. Sonny offers that he'll just take it over completely, leaving Ed penniless. And Ed, who has no choice in the matter because he can't pay the fine, which is $5,000, he has to. And the whole time, Perry has to watch Ed's family crying, knowing that their life savings is now down to nothing. It's a pretty scummy feeling. The one thing he can feel good about is he was able to find Paul work. He calls up Pete Strickland and tells him about the situation, and Pete actually does have something that Paul can help him out with. He heads to Paul's place that night and explains that the DA's office has gotten a tip that there's a hit out on a very influential African American in the city. His name is Melvin Perkins, and he runs a local hotel as well as a newspaper, and he probably has his hand in some things that aren't above board. He wants Paul to head down to the hotel that Perkins owns and just keep tabs on it. Keep eyes on him, take some photos, see if any weird people are around there. Paul knows that the only reason why he's getting hired to do this is because it's a colored hotel. But he also knows that he needs the money, and it's easy work. You just got to go there and snap a few photos inconspicuously. So he takes the job. Him, his wife, his child head down there. They pose as patrons of the hotel. They're just taking photos, and then they get the hell out of there. While Paul was doing this surveillance, Perry and Della were, quote, celebrating their win, although it doesn't really feel much like a celebration of Perry. He feels still pretty scuzzy. They get a visit from the new DA, Hamilton Berger. He's now running things. They have a pretty uncomfortable conversation about the morality of their jobs, one which Perry can't stomach, so he leaves. Once Perry leaves, Berger and Della start talking about their respective relationships. Berger is still single, and he asks Della, is everything all right with you and Hazel? And she says it's fine. But she also admits that with school and with work, she's probably just too busy for anything. That night, though, as Hazel is sleeping, curiosity gets the best of Della, and she calls up Anita. They have a good conversation on the phone, but nothing comes of it. Perry, however, had a horrible night. He got nice and drunk, heading to his office, and then eventually heading to a new swank bar in town that's run by Lupe. The only reason he showed up, though, was because that bar is his old house. He ended up selling the farm to Lupe, using that money to sustain his firm for a little bit. The bar, however, isn't on the up and up. It's not totally legal, but it is packed. And him and Lupe just sit down, drinking, talking about starting their lives over in some location. Not too far away, though, a very influential man is getting murdered. This guy's name is Brooks McCutchen, and his father is more influential than he is. Brooks kind of wants to be a big deal. He's got big plans, but the execution of those plans is always half-assed. One of these guys that talks a big game but never delivers. And his father, Lydell, kind of knows that. Lydell owns a club that Brooks runs, but he rarely stops by. And on one particular day, Lydell does stop by because he has something to discuss with Brooks. There was a fire the previous night on a boat that runs as a casino. Problem is, just like everything Brooks does, the execution was terrible, and his father had to come and lay down the law, saying, you got to step away from all of this. You're becoming a liability. And then he brings up the fact that Brooks is talking about bringing a baseball team to the city, something that Brooks really wants to get done. He tells Brooks to just walk away from this pipe dream of an idea. But Brooks does not walk away. In fact, the next day, he doubles down on it. Brooks is really the face of his father's company. Lydell is more comfortable just waiting in the shadows as Brooks makes speeches, shakes hands, kisses babies. One of the things that they have is a family soup kitchen, and that's where Brooks announces that he is, in fact, planning on bringing a baseball team to the city, which is going to create jobs, and it'll be something that people of Los Angeles can feel proud of. He talks about it like it is an absolute done deal. And while Lydell does have his concerns, if his son comes through with it, it'll be pretty damn impressive. But it's far from a done deal. He does have a former Major League player on his side to push for this, but he also has to meet with other owners and get approval from the league. On top of it, he gets bad news from Detective Holcomb, who is under his thumb. Holcomb has found out that they're looking into the fire on the rival casino boat. So he gives Brooks the tip of shutting his mouth because they could all go down for this. Brooks, however, isn't worried. What he's more focused on is a meeting that night on his own casino boat, the Morocco, where he's going to be meeting with that former baseball player and his attorney, who's put feelers out to other Major League Baseball teams if they're interested in moving their team to L.A. Before he leaves, he has his two boys kiss his lucky gold coin, and then he heads off. But the meeting doesn't go as planned. He basically gets told it's not going to happen. They're not going to come west of the Mississippi. Nobody thinks that Los Angeles can be a baseball town, and that's really frustrating to Brooks because he's put everything into this plan. He's not going to give up, though. He's going to keep pushing forward. Or at least he had planned to. Until he was sitting in his car, waiting to go home, thinking about what happened that night, when somebody comes up on him and shoots him right in the head. The body of Brooks McCutchen is found the next day, and it doesn't take long for police to nab two perpetrators. Berger holds a press conference at City Hall where he announces that Rafael and Mateo Guiardo, who are 18 and 20, have been nabbed for the crime. To make sure that these two pay for what they did, Berger is assigning his top prosecutor to the case, a guy named Thomas Milligan, who tells reporters that he will accept the death penalty and nothing less. While Perry and Della have obviously heard about the McCutchen murder, it's not really on their radar. They're still dealing with Sonny Grice, who is trying out some new produce suppliers, and he wants Della and Perry to write up some contracts. The latest place he's trying is Goldstein's Finest Produce, but you can already tell that Sonny isn't happy with what they brought him. When they get back to the office, though, Luisa and Sofia Gallardo are waiting for them. Sofia is Mateo's wife, and Luisa is their aunt. They want Perry to help out with the case because they claim that the boys did nothing wrong and they're being railroaded. After what Perry did for Emily Dotson, they think that Perry Mason would be the perfect lawyer. But they tell him, we don't really do that. Both Della and Perry apologize for the fact that they can't really help out, and Luisa seems to take it okay, but Sofia does not. She yells at Perry in Spanish, and all Perry can say is, sorry, I'm not the right man for this. That night, though, Luisa and Sofia's plea is still on Della's mind, and she has the perfect opportunity to help out because she's meeting with Berger. They're going to a party together at a woman named Camilla Nygaard's house. She's rich, single, and a successful woman in the area. Della tries to get Berger to accept a plea deal where it gives the boys parole, but Berger's not about to do that. He's only been on the job for about a month, and this is a big case. Brooks McCutchen's death is big news because he was a huge part of the community. The party they're attending that night is for a piano concert, and they even have a tribute to Brooks McCutchen because he was supposed to be in attendance. The concert is definitely something that neither of them were looking forward to, and when it ends, they're pretty happy. Della, however, does run into Nygaard, and she thanks her for the invite, telling her it was a lovely concert, and the two chat about Camilla's success. But this McCutchen case wasn't just on Della's mind, it was also on Perry's mind as well. While Della was hobnobbing with socialites, Perry was hanging out with Strickland. Perry mentions how the Gallardo's aunt came to visit him that day, but he's not going to take the case. And Strickland mentions how Milligan wants this one really bad because this could be a resume builder. Ultimately, he wants to get to Washington, D.C. There is reason why Milligan should feel good about the case. They found McCutchen's gold coin on the boys. Pete breaks down to Perry how Milligan is going to play it off in court, that the boys came up on him. They tried to rob him. McCutchen fought him off. One of them panicked, and they shot him in the head. But what Pete knows, just from his sources being in City Hall, is that this wasn't a point-blank shooting. Whoever did this shot Brooks McCutchen at range, and that just smells really fishy to Perry. Once Strickland heads out for the night, the curiosity is just getting to Perry, so he decides to sneak down to the police impound and look at the car. He starts looking at the bullet trajectory, the angle to which the bullet came from. None of it really makes sense that this was just a scared kid at night who shot once and ended up hitting Brooks McCutchen in the head. He has to get home pretty quick, though, and get into bed because the next morning he has a meeting at Teddy's new school. Linda and Perry meet with the teacher, but Perry just wants to get the hell out of there because after he's done with this meeting, he blows off a meeting that he had with Della and a potential client to go meet with the Gallardos. Both Mateo and Raphael are very hesitant to trust Perry because they've been burned already. Perry explains that his aunt and Sofia came to visit him to take the case, but before he does that, he's got to know what he's dealing with. When Perry explains that Luisa and Sofia came to visit him, the boys then kind of buy in. They start going through a few exercises that Perry has for him, including holding their hand up. That gives Perry a clue on how high they had to hold the gun to get that shot off at that range and trajectory. He then sits down and wants to hear the boys' side of the story. He knows that the bus driver picked them out of a lineup as the killers, and the boys claim, well, that was because we were on that bus. I'd be able to pick him out of a lineup too. They get on that bus to collect bottles, and they were collecting bottles that night when they found the gold coin in the trash. They ended up selling it, and that's really what ended up leading to their arrest. Perry believes their story. The next day when he comes in the office, he meets with Della, and they're both on the same page. Sofia and Luisa's plea to them has just been sitting with them so long that they've agreed to take the case. Della wants to formulate a plan. Take this slow and focus on it step by step. Build their case, attack theirs, work the body, and the head will fall. And that's something she picked up when she went on a date the previous night to a boxing match with Anita St. Pierre. The only issue that Della has is how they're going to afford it, because the Gallardos can't pay for this, and they're not a charity. They need to figure out a way to have some cash income, and that's when they both come up with the idea of Sonny Grice. They go over to Grice's store and convince him to hire him on retainer to help him expand his business. There's a bunch of different abandoned buildings that would be perfect. They gave him these grand ideas of a sunny market in every neighborhood, but in order to do that, they're going to have to do a lot of work for it. In reality, they're not going to have to do a lot of work for it, but they convince him that they are, and he agrees to put them on retainer, which is ultimately going to pay their way to defending the Gallardos. So Perry and Della agree to take the case, and the next day there's the arraignment. Milligan asks the court to not accept bail, claiming that the boys will run off to Mexico. And Perry points out they've never been to Mexico. They're Mexican Americans, but they were born here. They don't know anybody in Mexico. That's dumb. Unfortunately, the judge doesn't seem to be a big fan of Perry, definitely doesn't seem to be a big fan of his clients, and he denies the boys of bail. When they exit court, the media is waiting to grill Perry on how he feels about the fact that the Gallardos were denied bail, and he says, "We weren't expecting fair treatment." One of the reporters asks, "Well, then you believe that they're innocent?" And Perry says, "Yeah, we wouldn't have taken the case if we didn't. I mean, the evidence is flimsy and see-through, and we're going to prove that at trial." And that's when another reporter says, "So you're not concerned with the rumors that forensics has found Rafael Gallardo's fingerprints on Brooks McCutchen's car?" And Perry has to play it off like he's not concerned, but he absolutely is. This is the first he's hearing about it, and he knows that it's got to be true. That's why Milligan floated it out to the press, and that's why Milligan was so confident in the court. And what pisses off Perry is the fact that Milligan clearly isn't as dumb as he wanted him to be. He's pretty smart, so Perry's got his work cut out for him. Della and Perry head back to the office to regroup, and one of the people that they're going to want to hire to help them out is Paul Drake, who visits them, and he's not happy. He did that job for Pete Strickland, but he feels like he was used. When he handed over the information he found, he was doing so under the assumption that there was a hit out on Perkins. In reality, the DA used the information that Paul got them to arrest Perkins on racketeering, loan sharking, and this is a big blow to the African American community. So Paul doesn't feel great about the job that he just did, and he wants to take it up with Perry because ultimately Perry introduced him to Pete. He confronts Perry about this, and Perry feels horrible about it. He was really just trying to get Paul some work. They bring up the Gallardo case saying they could use Paul for it, but Paul wants more than that. He wants to trust them. And he tells Perry, "I just don't know how we're going to get there." And Perry says, "Honestly, I don't know how we're going to get there either." And that is something that Drake does believe, so it appears he's going to join the case. Now it's just a matter of seeing what the prosecution has. Perry goes to collect the evidence box, and by the way, it's a box that's been tampered with. Somebody paid one of the cops to slip something in there, and Perry has no idea about that. But Perry looks over the box while Della looks over some of Brooks McCutchen's books. One of the things that Perry has been able to piecemeal together already is the fact that Brooks owned the Morocco boat and a rival boat was set on fire. And that's really one of the keys to this. When Della looked over Brooks's book, she found some very disconcerting things. Brooks's boat, the Morocco, was literally and figuratively a sinking ship. Brooks would have this thing fixed up and then stiff the companies for the money. Della was able to find a trail of unpaid debts, and every time a creditor would come after Brooks, he would just liquidate and then dump the Morocco's ownership into a new shell company. This would allow the company that owned the Morocco to rack up bills, which they couldn't pay, and then they would just sell the ship from that company to another company. It would leave nothing behind to make good on the debts and screw everybody over. Paul and Perry know that they have to go on the Morocco and find out what's going on in this ship, because ultimately they need to figure out who would want Brooks McCutchen dead. They head over there, and Perry starts asking one waitress a few questions regarding if she knows Brooks, but she gets very uncomfortable. While Perry poked around in the front of the house, Paul went to the back asking some of the cooks if they know anything. They tell Paul that they were in dry dock all last week. High rollers don't come there. And when Paul points out the produce that they have, they say, "Yeah, all we ever get is potatoes and carrots, nothing more." And that produce, by the way, comes from Goldstein's Produce, the same place that was supplying Sonny Grice, a company whose owner was recently subpoenaed by a grand jury. When Paul is done talking to the staff, he's walking around the ship, and that's when Perry pops out of nowhere because he's being chased by Holcomb and a few of his men. They want to catch Perry before he gets off the ship. Perry gets out in the casino floor, and the men are still after him, but they can't cause too big of a scene because there are a bunch of patrons around. So Perry, thinking fast, makes an announcement to the room, introducing himself as Perry Mason, the lawyer, but then offering up a toast to Holcomb. Holcomb knows that he can't take Perry Mason down. He's just going to have to let him go. Holding him there would cause too much of a scene, so Perry's won this one. But as Perry and Paul were exiting the Morocco, the owner of Goldstein's Produce was busy being murdered. The man who ends up killing Goldstein calls up a rich socialite named Grippen, who runs in the same circles as Lydell McCutchen. He tells Grippen that Goldstein has been killed. Grippen hangs up the phone, goes into his drawer, pulls out a grand jury subpoena for a Brooks McCutchen, and he starts burning it. In episode 3, Perry and Milligan go to court where Milligan asks the judge to start the case right away, which Perry is completely against. He wants sufficient time to prepare this thing. The judge kind of meets in the middle, saying that the case will start in 3 weeks. It isn't a total loss for Perry, though. He does get a couple extra peremptory challenges. When they leave court, though, Perry's pretty pissed. He turns to Della and says, 3 weeks? We need 3 months to prepare this case. That means he, Della, and Paul are going to really have to get after this thing and do it quickly. They all head home for the day, though, where things aren't going so great at Paul's. He's still staying with his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law is really stressed out because there's no work. And he tells Paul that there would be work if Perkins wasn't locked away. At this point, he still doesn't know that Paul's information was the one that got Perkins locked away in the first place. It makes Paul feel even guiltier about the situation. Because as his brother-in-law tells it, Perkins had his hand in everything, and he was making people hire from the African-American communities. Now with Perkins locked away, they're not coming around anymore, and no one's getting work. Over with Della that night, she was supposed to go home, but she went right back to the office to continue working, where she gets a visit from Anita, who tells her, we both have to work, so why can't we do it together? And the two are carrying on a little bit of an affair as they hook up, smoke cigarettes, and maybe get some work done. Perry, meanwhile, is haunted by the sins of his past. He can't shake what happened to Emily Dotson, so he decides to head to the court and check in on his clients. He brings them a couple of items that he thinks that they're going to need, and he realizes that he doesn't really know them all that well. So he asks about their upbringing, their backstory. Their parents owned a farm, but the government took it away because they needed to build something else. He then asks about the fingerprint being found on Brooks McCutchen's car, to which both of them say that's impossible. There's no way that happened. And Perry just had to ask. He finishes up this conversation with asking how they're doing, and he finds out that they're not doing so great because they're getting targeted. People are putting glass in their food. So in the meantime, Perry's going to ask the judge to kind of look out for him a bit. He finds out that the judge is still in his chambers, so he goes to pay him a visit, but the judge kind of laughs off his request, saying, this is prison. We're not going to have preferential treatment for those that aren't fitting in. It's pretty clear to Perry that the judge doesn't really think much of Raphael and Mateo. In his minds, they're guilty. And while he appreciates Perry's fight for the truth, he thinks he's going to find out that the truth is they killed Brooks. But Perry does convince him to change Raphael and Mateo out of the prison cell they're in and get them to a more secure, safe location. The next morning, Perry and Della go and head to Camilla Nygaard's. Della remembered that during that piano ceremony that she attended, Camilla had mentioned that Brooks McCutchen was supposed to be in attendance, so she figured it was worth asking Camilla about Brooks and his character. They're greeted at first by Melville Phipps, Camilla's attorney. When they were walking up, Perry overheard a conversation about Camilla trying to secure some new oil wells, and he makes a comment about the fact that people are still drilling for oil. He didn't know that they were, and Camilla just wants to make sure that if there is land out there, she wants to own it so her competitors don't. Some of those competitors are the McCutchens. They seem a little more cutthroat than Nygaard. An example of this is when a guy shows up at one of the oil rigs and asks Lydell for $200 that Brooks owed him. The guy didn't know who else to turn to. Now with Brooks dead, he figured Lydell would be the best option. And Lydell pays him after having a piece of machinery rip some skin off his face. He didn't really appreciate the fact that the guy was calling his office and the fact that he showed up on the work site. Hard to imagine Nygaard doing that. Although, I guess you never know. Don't judge a book by its cover. While she said glowing things about Brooks at that piano ceremony, Brooks McCutchen, his father, there's a lot of other ones, they don't think too much of Camilla Nygaard. They've said a lot of negative things about her, and while she's taking the high road, she doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about them. Camilla's known Brooks since he was a child, but she says while he was nice to look at, there wasn't much under the surface. It turns out Brooks actually came to Camilla looking to fund his baseball stadium when all the banks went belly up in 1931. She said no. One of the reasons she wasn't willing to step in and help him out was he was trying to do it behind his father's back, and she wasn't willing to go there. This conversation is going really well until Perry asks about a place called Sandhaven. He found a number in Brooks McCutchen's wallet, decided to call it, and it was a place called Sandhaven. When Perry brings this up to Camilla, she gets really upset, telling him that she's not going to discuss tawdry rumors. When Della tries to step in and calm everybody down, Camilla tells her, well, then he should keep that to himself. The Lawson girl's been through enough. And that name alone is enough for Perry to go searching and digging a little more. Find out what is hiding in this place. He goes to Sandhaven, and it looks to be a retirement community for really, really elderly and sick people. He's able to locate the Lawson room, and it's for a woman named Noreen Lawson. Even though he's not supposed to go in, he does. He starts snapping some photos, looking around, and then he overhears somebody coming in, so he hides in the bathroom, and when he peeks out the door, there's a young woman there, in a wheelchair, despondent. He starts trying to get her attention, but she just doesn't pay him any attention at all. So he starts snapping some photos of her until he's caught and kicked out. The whole scene, though, is very weird, and he wants to find out exactly what Brooks was hiding. So when he gets back to the office, he meets up with Della and Paul, and they have Marion look into who this woman is. While Marion is doing that, they get into the case. Perry really wants to look at Holcomb for this. After looking at some business papers, he knows that Holcomb partnered with Brooks on that gambling boat. With Brooks dead, he now owns all of it. While this theory holds water, Della just doesn't buy it. But it's just a seed of reasonable doubt. Although Della says, yeah, it's reasonable doubt that Milligan will tear apart in court. There's no proof of any of it. While they look into the case a little bit more, Paul needs to get going because he wants to get to the Hooverville where the boys were living. He wants to corroborate their story and nail down a timeline of maybe when they left and what they were doing and who they were doing it with. Perry, meanwhile, had to head home because he had to get his apartment ready for Teddy, who was staying over. Linda was working some overtime, and Teddy's not too happy about it. Perry's trying his best to be more into Teddy's life, but it's a struggle. Teddy's kind of despondent, at least at first, until he gets a toy train. That's cool. And the two share some bonding time going to a movie, which leads to Teddy not doing his homework. When they get to school the next day, it's Perry who has to explain to Teddy's teacher, Miss Ames, why he didn't have his homework done. And there's a little flirtation going on when Miss Ames finds out that Perry and Linda are divorced. While their first meeting didn't go so hot, the second one is going way better. She actually seems pretty cool. After dropping Teddy off, Perry heads to the office where there's two guys waiting for him from Lydell's office. They bring him to meet with Lydell. He doesn't appreciate Perry digging into his son's affairs, and he wants him to dig someplace else. When Perry asks, what hole do you want me to dig in? Lydell says, any hole that's not going to drag my son's name through the mud. He tries to actually play the sympathy card, saying how much Brooks' death has done to not only Brooks' widow, but himself. But Perry ain't buying it, and he brings up Noreen Lawson. That name definitely gets Lydell's attention. And that's when he shows Perry that Perry isn't the only one who's digging. Lydell starts talking about what happened with Emily Dodson, the fact that she killed herself. The fact that Perry tried his hardest to seek justice and it didn't matter in the end because he couldn't save her. He wraps up the conversation by telling Perry, if you keep digging into my son, I will burn you. When he gets back to the office that day, he finally comes clean to Della about what happened with Emily Dodson. If he was looking for sympathy, he certainly doesn't get it from Della. She rips into Perry for not telling her and also for not doing something about it because he could have. When Perry says, why did she come to me, her lawyer, why didn't she go to a shrink? Della says, well, you should have gotten her a shrink. But Perry tells Della, I never thought she was actually going to do it. But this haunts me. And it's at that moment that Della realizes that is why he wanted to leave criminal cases. She's pretty pissed. This affects her because they're partners. And all he can do is apologize. One person missing from this meeting is Paul. He had a really busy day. He headed to the Hooverville where he heard a couple of gunshots, and when he went to investigate, it was a couple of small children trying to kill a rat. He asked where they got a gun, and they explained that they rented it. And he didn't know such a thing was possible, but he was able to pay the kids to tell him which person in the Hooverville was renting guns, and he posed as a guy who was disheveled looking to rent a firearm. The guy had about 5 guns matching the description that was used to kill Brooks, and he rented all of them. He then, one by one, shot bullets into a stack of phone books, retrieved the bullet, and then checked the ballistics. And unfortunately for him, he found a match. He went back to the guy's shack and asked him if he rented to the Gallardos, And while he doesn't come out and say he did, it's pretty clear by his face that he did, in fact, rent that gun to them. Their case just got a whole lot tougher because there's clearly something that the Gallardo brothers are hiding. In episode 4, everybody comes back to the office Monday and they start talking about what they did on the weekend. Everybody had a pretty busy weekend with Della hanging out with Anita. They had a little bit of a sleepover, and it was something that Della desperately needed because ever since Perry told her about what happened with Emily Dodson, it's been consuming her just like it's been consuming Perry. So she needed kind of a little bit of a getaway, even though she's cheating. Stop cheating, girl. Perry, meanwhile, went to go take Teddy horseback riding, and they just so happened to run into Teddy's teacher, Miss Ames. Turns out Miss Ames teaches horseback riding class at that farm for extra money. So she takes Teddy and Perry along for a ride, and while they're on a trail, you find out that Miss Ames recently got to LA about a year ago after she got divorced. So she's a free agent, and she does seem to like herself a little bit of Perry because as they go their separate ways, she says, hey, I'm here every Saturday. Come back if you need another lesson. When everybody gets back in the office, though, Monday, they're ready to work. No one more so than Marianne, who has done some digging and been able to find Noreen's brother. Perry was tipped off that Noreen might have a sibling because there was a picture of the two in her room. It turns out this sibling is not just any normal sibling. His name's Vincent Taylor, and he's a councilman. He just so happens to be a councilman in the district where Brooks McCutchen was trying to put his baseball stadium. They think it's maybe a bit of a reach, but it's something they could go on. And as Perry and Dell are discussing it, Paul Drake casually walks in and puts the gun on the table. He tells both of them, this is the murder weapon. And I got it from a dude selling guns 30 feet away from where Mateo and Raphael live. Guys, they did it. This was not an easy decision for Paul to make. He consulted his wife on what he should do. Give the gun to Perry and let him know that his clients are guilty, or not give the gun to Perry and risk the chance that he's surprised in court. Ultimately, he decided the right thing to do was to give it to Perry. Della locks it up in his safe, and then the three head over to go meet with Raphael and Mateo. They don't initially tell Raphael and Mateo about the found gun. They just ask him, okay, this is your last chance, tell us what happened. And Raphael and Mateo stick to the story that they weren't there, they don't know anything. And that is when Perry says, okay, well, meet my lead investigator, Paul Drake. And Paul tells them what he found. Perry is really pissed off. He feels like the brothers lied to him. And he gets so mad that he says, you know what, I'm probably just going to give the gun to Paul here to give to the prosecutor so they can hang you. And he starts walking out, and that's when the brothers come clean on what actually happened. They tell all of them that they just wanted a quick, easy score. That's it. When they saw Brooks in the car, they figured that that would be the easy mark. Car like that, he's got to have a lot of cash on him. Mateo had the gun. Raphael was supposed to walk up and take his money, but Brooks fought back. Raphael started screaming for Mateo to do something, so he shot him in the head. So the boys give Perry a confession, but none of it really makes sense to any of them. Paul, Della, Perry, that story just doesn't really add up. But Perry's not really in the right mind frame to think about this. He's so upset that he was lied to. He wants off the case, but both Della and Paul say you can't. Unfortunately, you're stuck defending these guys. They deserve a defense, and if you hop off the case, you're all but sending them to the gallows. And at that moment, Perry doesn't really care because they are guilty. He screams at both Paul and Della, what, they should go free after killing a father, a citizen? This is ridiculous. But he also knows that Della and Paul are right. He's stuck defending these guys. So he storms back in the courthouse and tries to make a plea deal with the prosecution. He meets with Milligan and Berger and proposes a deal, but neither of them want to do it. Milligan especially is really, really smug about it. And Perry says, you're telling me you have no idea what Brooks McCutchen was into? I mean, there are people dancing all over this kid's grave around town. Milligan stares at Perry and just says, yeah, he's bluffing. And Perry shoots back, am I? Because I have a real pretty half-dead girl with Brooks' name written all over it. And Perry can tell by Milligan's face that Milligan had no idea about this. So Perry really enjoys saying, oh, you missed that one, didn't you? He tries one last-ditch plea, reminding the prosecution that he only needs to sway one juror. They need to convince 12. But Berger tells him, we have enough evidence. We're not going to do a deal. That night, Perry meets up with Strickland and has dinner with him, and Strickland's working for the prosecution. So he kind of mocks Perry for even thinking that the prosecution would settle with him. He tells him that the prosecution has been getting on detectives, just like himself, to dig into the clients and find out everything they can. But thanks to the prosecution and also the pull of Lydell McCutchen, it's not just Perry's clients who are being dragged through the mud, it's also Perry himself. Lydell has made it his mission to sully the name of Perry Mason. There are 4 stories in the newspaper all about Mason, ripping him, calling him things like Maggot Mason. So Perry's a little stressed out about the situation, and he turns to Pete and says, look, what's it going to take to make all of this go away? But Strickland isn't going to give Perry any information because he gets his paycheck signed from Hamilton Burger, not from Perry Mason. That doesn't mean the two aren't friends, though. They read another story about Lydell McCutchen regarding his prized racehorse, and they decide, you know what? Let's go ride that thing. So they go to the stables, drunk. They break in, and Perry hops on this racehorse and starts zipping around the park. And he's having the time of his life until they're caught. The lights go on, the horse throws Perry off of them, and they get the hell out of there. The fact they almost got caught, though, really pisses off Pete, who screams at Perry, I told you this was going to happen. I'm going home. I got to be up and work in 2 hours. And when Perry asks, what, to kiss Burger's ass? He yells back at Perry, I'm just trying to keep my job, Perry. So Perry wasn't really expecting that response from his friend. The next day, Perry heads to Teddy's school. He blows right past Miss Ames and finds Teddy and says, come on, grab your stuff. We're getting out of here. It might be just he has to go, or it might be that he's worried about repercussions from Lydell McCutchen if he finds out who took his horse. But Perry is clearly in a rush. And one of the parents makes a snide remark about the way Perry is treating his son. But when that same parent calls Perry Maggot Mason, Perry just instinctively pulls back and punches him in the face. Even Perry's surprised by his actions. Everybody's shocked. And Miss Ames holds Teddy back and just says to Perry, get out of here. I'll take him home. Perry's so disappointed in his behavior that he just goes to the movies and even turns down the cheapest blowjob I've ever heard of, 25 cents. He gives the girl 50 cents to just go away. But it turns out that was a genius move because late that night, as Perry is sitting with his thoughts in his apartment, he gets a knock at the door and it's Miss Ames. She got his place from the registrar's office and she wants to let him know that Teddy got home okay. She also brings Perry food. After a little bit of awkwardness, Perry finally gets the message and invites her in, and she gladly accepts that invitation. But somebody at that law firm was working that day. Della headed to go have lunch with Camilla Nygaard. She starts asking her about Brooks's business affairs. If Brooks tried to get any other investors into the baseball stadium like he did with Camilla. But Camilla completely changes the subject, getting it on to the relationship between Perry and Della. And after a little bit of back and forth, Della admits that while it can be rocky at times, Perry is her best shot at getting her own name on her own firm. Now, the last member of the team, Paul, didn't go to work that day, but he was clearly thinking about the job. He and his wife finally get the house themselves, and he's just not in the mood to do what you would want to do with your wife when you finally get the house to yourself. And what he can't shake is what the boys told him. That story doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, these boys getting the perfect shot on a moving target. So it's his wife who says, Paul, you're an investigator. Go investigate. Now, we got 45 minutes. Let's get on with this thing. After the 45 minutes, and when nighttime hits, Paul decides to do just that, investigate. He heads down to the Hooverville, finds the guy who is selling the guns, and brings him beer and food to tell him a little bit more about selling guns to Rafael and Mateo. He tells Paul that he rented them guns every single day. They would go and practice shooting bottles every single day, which doesn't add up to the story that they were collecting bottles. The thing that Paul can't figure out is where they got the money to rent guns every single day. But what is clear to him is that they were practicing for something. Shortly after Paul leaves, Mateo's wife wakes up in the middle of the night. The last time they went to go visit Rafael and Mateo, Rafael slipped her a note. It was a drawing of a car in the Hooverville. So late at night, Sophia sneaks out, she finds the car, and she looks underneath, and there is a whole bunch of cash hidden. But she's caught by Rafael and Mateo's mother, who wants to know what the hell she's doing. And then the last person that we'll discuss is Brooks McCutchen's business partner, Detective Holcomb. He goes to the Morocco and it's completely dead on a Friday night. The fire to the rival ship has killed his business. He orders a baked potato only to find out that they're out. They were getting those potatoes for free, but that dried up once Goldstein died. A very annoyed Holcomb says he couldn't get a decent ship from his dad's fleet, but great, he got free cauliflower. Brooks was just a really bad business partner. Holcomb mentions how it wasn't until 5 months ago Brooks started throwing money their way. The next day, he goes to what was Goldstein's produce to find out exactly what business arrangement Brooks had with them, but the new boss has no idea. He tells the guy, look, I don't care, I'm more interested in the financial particulars of this arrangement. What was the play? Where was the money coming from? Who was getting a cut? But the guy still says, I don't know. So Holcomb goes to talk to the drivers. And the driver who delivered to the Morocco just so happens to be the same guy who had his face chewed off by Lydell. Doesn't take much for the guy to admit that he did in fact deliver to the Morocco. Holcomb tells him that he's pretty sure Brooks was running some kind of game, and he was making good money off of it. He just wants to figure out what it was. He tells him that if he helps him add everything up, then there might be something in it for him. And the guy tells him that Brooks and Goldstein had them running trucks outside regular businesses for about 5 months. But all they were moving was vegetables. They would pick up the produce from the ships in the middle of the night when nobody was around, and sometimes he would bring the load down to the Morocco. Holcomb asked the guy why in the world a ship would be coming in with vegetables. They're in California. They're flush with veggies. And the driver says, I have no idea. Ask the McCutchens. It was their ship. In episode 5, it's the first day of the trial, and it's the last place Perry wants to be. He'd much rather stay in bed with Miss Ames, but he does eventually make his way out of bed and make it to court. And his face says it all. He doesn't want to defend people that he knows are guilty, but he also doesn't have a choice. This case is the talk of the town. This thing isn't just being covered by the newspapers. It's being covered by the press as well, including a radio host that is really riling the folks of Los Angeles up. He's making Perry Mason out to be a scumbag and the Gallardo brothers out to be Satan incarnate. All of it, though, is simply the bidding of Lionel McCutchen. Today's just the opening statement to the jury, though, and the message is clear from the prosecution. The Gallardo brothers are guilty. The message from Perry is, after he lays out the evidence, the jury won't be asking who wanted Brooks McCutchen dead. They'll be asking who didn't want Brooks McCutchen dead. While Perry was addressing the court, he sent Paul to go talk to Councilman Taylor. Taylor is the brother of Noreen. He had been blowing Paul off every time Paul called his office for a meeting, so Paul had to go have a one-on-one with him as Taylor was cutting the ribbon of a brand new park. He tries to blow Paul off in person until Paul shows him a picture of Noreen, and Taylor pulls him aside and says, all right, what do you want? Paul asks Vince, I'm just trying to connect dots here and figure out how your sister ended up in this situation. And Vincent Taylor tells him that it was a car accident, and he sticks to that story. When Paul brings up the fact that his sister clearly had something to do with Brooks McCutchen, and he thinks the stadium project was in connection with it, Taylor just evades the questioning, telling him that he really doesn't appreciate private investigators snooping around family business. Paul has to walk away empty-handed, but he knows that there's something that Taylor isn't telling him. The next day is the first day that the prosecution can call witnesses, and the first witness they call is the bus driver. He all but puts the gun in the Gallardo's hands. You can tell just from his tone that this guy not only thinks the Gallardo brothers are guilty, but he's a bit racist against Mexican people. Perry, though, gets up there and cross-examines him and does a really good job of making the guy look foolish. He has the guy admit that in the end, he doesn't know where the brothers went or what they were doing. Even though it looked like Perry did a pretty good job cross-examining him, Sophia and Luisa are not satisfied. They feel like Perry could have done more. And Perry tells him, my job right now is to make that jury think that it was anybody else other than Mateo and Rafael. And they say, well, what if somebody else did want Brooks dead? They bring Perry back to their shack, and they show him what they found under that car, the bag full of cash. Now Perry's starting to get a clearer vision of what happened, that these brothers didn't just choose to kill Brooks, but that they were paid by somebody to do it. As Perry is leaving the Hooverville, though, he is unknowingly being watched by somebody, likely one of Lydell's guys. And it's not just Perry. Looks like Lydell also has people following Della when she goes to a gay club with Anita. When Perry gets back to the office, he meets with his brain trust, Paul and Della, and he tells them that neither Sophia or Louisa know when the brothers were hired or by whom. But this makes a lot more sense than the robbery gone wrong story that they were told. At least now, all Perry and the group have to do is find out who hired the brothers and who wanted Brooks dead. They start talking about the possibility of Taylor doing it, but Della shoots holes in that, just like she did with Holcomb the week before. They all know that they can't really go deeper with this until they talk to the Gallardo brothers themselves, find out what they're not telling them. They're planning on talking to them the next day at the court, but when they head to the courthouse, they're pretty surprised because Berger and Milligan offer them a deal. It's more so Berger, you can tell that this is eating Milligan up inside, but what Perry and Della can't figure out is why. Because Berger was so adamant that they had the boys dead to rights. So it doesn't really make sense that all of a sudden they've changed their opinion, considering that they're the ones that are currently calling witnesses to the stand. Either way, Perry's going to take it to the Gallardo brothers, but the deal isn't that great. But it tips off Perry and Della to the fact that Berger must know something that they don't. Della and Perry then head down to the prison to meet with the brothers, and the brothers tell them the truth. Maybe. I mean, this is like the 5th time they've told them, quote, the truth. But they tell them that killing Brooks wasn't just about the money. Brooks' stadium project left the Gallardo brothers homeless because the stadium was built on where their home used to be, and they were just kicked out of there. The cops showed up one night to evict everybody in the neighborhood, and that included the Gallardos, who unfortunately lost their sister because she ran back into the house, which was on fire, and ended up dying. Perry then brings up the deal, and Mateo wants to consider it, but Raphael does not. And Perry convinces the boys to turn the deal down, because as he tells them, whoever is pressuring Berger is doing so just based on what we know. And this person has a lot of power. Look, you boys killed a man, your finger's on that trigger, but your finger clearly isn't the only one that was on that trigger. So let's dive deeper. Perry then sends word to Berger that they're not taking the deal and the court case is still on. It then takes Perry a little bit, but the boys eventually tell him that the guy who hired them to kill Brooks McCutchen is someone named Ozzie Jackson. Now it's just a matter of tracking Ozzie Jackson down. And Paul has a pretty good idea of where this guy might be located, and also the fact that he's not the guy pulling the strings, he's simply a middleman. Unfortunately, though, Paul has his work cut out for him because the only recognizable thing the boys can tell Perry about Ozzie Jackson is the fact that he always wears Converse sneakers. That's it. When Paul goes home, he checks the photos that he took from Perkins' stakeout. There was a guy there wearing Converse sneakers, so he shows the picture to his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law recognizes the guy. He tells him that he's a part of Perkins' crew, but warns him, you really should think twice about sticking your nose in this. Paul doesn't want to go right to Perkins, who is now out of prison. He wants to just snoop around the area to try to find Ozzie, but he comes up empty. Nobody knows where this guy is. Eventually, he has to walk up to Perkins' club, and he bargains with him, showing him the photos that he himself took, but saying, I know who took these photos. I know these photos gave you trouble with the people downtown. I know you're out on bail. And I know that the only way that you end up going to jail is if the guy who took these photos testifies against you. But I can make sure that he doesn't. And all I ask in return is that you find me Ozzie Jackson. Because word is that Ozzie Jackson paid those kids to shoot Brooks McCutchen. But I'm fairly certain that Ozzie was a middleman, which means that he got paid. And I don't think he ended up paying you, which would be customary. So you find me Ozzie Jackson, and I'll find you the guy who took these pictures. Perkins agrees, and later that night, Paul gets a phone call from Perkins telling him, come down to the hotel, I've got Jackson. When Paul shows up, Ozzie's sitting down, but while he's not tied up, he might as well be. He ain't going anywhere. When Ozzie refuses to talk to Paul, Perkins bitch slaps him, forcing him to talk to Paul. But before Perkins allows Paul to ask any questions, really, of substance, he wants his end of the deal. And Paul says, all right, I'll tell you who took those pictures. It was me. I never meant for it to get that far, but I'm telling you now, I'm not going to testify against you. Perkins looks at him because he's pissed and says, your word, that it? I need you to understand whose kingdom you're in. You know what? If you want answers, you'll have to put a beating on this man until your fist aches. And Paul doesn't want to beat up Ozzie, but he also doesn't have a choice. Perkins is big, and he's got two other guys who are big. Every time Ozzie says he doesn't know something, he gets punched in the face. But eventually, the story that he tells Paul is that he was paid. It was from some guy who's fancy and he's dealt with for a while. The guy had a drug addict of a wife, and he would come down and pay Ozzy not to sell to her. Up until that point, he hadn't seen this guy until he showed up offering 10 G's to kill Brooks McCutchen. Ozzy isn't sure what make and model this guy drove. He thinks it's a blue Lincoln, but he's not confident in it. Now Paul has something to go off of. The next day is a really good day for Perry in court. While looking over some of the evidence, he noticed that the fingerprint from the Gallardo brothers on Brooks's car was reversed. So when the prosecution calls up a fingerprint expert, he confirms that the fingerprint is Rafael Mateo's, but when Perry gets up to cross-examine him, the guy has to admit that the fingerprint is reversed and that it's impossible to do that, which means it was placed at the scene. This is a big, shocking moment for the trial. It's one that leaves Milligan with a lot of egg on his face. It's at this moment that Milligan realizes just how good Perry is at his job, and he knows he needs some dirt on him. So he sends Pete Strickland. When Perry gets back to his apartment one day after visiting Miss Ames, he sees that somebody was in there, and that person was Pete, but Perry doesn't know that. And then finally, love has to die with Della. She gets back to the boarding house, and Hazel confronts her because she called the office, Della wasn't there, and she knows that Della is hiding something, and it's probably a relationship. So unfortunately, that love probably is ending. In episode 6, Perry has to get ready for court, but he does so gingerly because he knows that somebody is able to get into his apartment. So he goes out the back. Della, meanwhile, gets dropped off by Anita, and she actually suggests that the two move in together, which Della doesn't understand how exactly that would work because it is the 1930s. That sort of thing isn't really allowed, but she considers it, and she tells Anita, I'll let you know. That day in court, the prosecution calls their final witness. It's a coin expert. But that coin expert wasn't supposed to be the final witness. They actually had a long list of witnesses that they were going to call, but the prosecution decided to rest, which is going to give the defense the ability to call their witnesses. Although this isn't a good thing for Perry or Della. They both were planning on the prosecution calling more witnesses, which would give them more time to form a defense. So they're going to have to rush things along. But Perry's mind is elsewhere. He can't stop focusing on the fact that somebody broke into his house and he doesn't know who they are. They're also still trying to figure out why the prosecution offered that deal. Della walks up to Hamilton Berger and tries to get some information out of him, saying, "Are you all right? I do care about you. You can trust me." But Hamilton just blows her off, telling her, "Good luck with your defense." Meanwhile, Paul was doing some work for Perry, delivering a subpoena to Holcomb, which he wasn't too thrilled about. But he also has to track down this car of the guy who ended up hiring Ozzie Jackson. And in order to do that, he's going to have to stake out the corner. And he's going to have to stake it out all day. So he enlists his brother-in-law to help out, paying him some money to sit in a car and just write down everything that he sees. Every car, every make, every model, and every license plate. If he sees it, he writes it down. They're going to work in 12-hour shifts. And hopefully, they'll be able to find this mystery person. It starts that night. And because it's so dark, Morris, Paul's brother-in-law, has trouble seeing. He writes down what he can, but he just can't make out every single detail that late at night. And when he gets home, Paul is not happy about it. It causes a pretty big confrontation between the two, with Claire siding with her brother because Paul's being pretty disrespectful to Morris in his own house. But Paul's realizing that if he wants a job done right, he probably has to just do it on his own. So he's going to head out that night and stake out the corner. Meanwhile, Perry gets to the office the next day, and he's surprised because there's Holcomb waiting for him. Holcomb wasn't too happy about the fact that he was subpoenaed, and he doesn't want to take the stand. Perry says, "You were Brooks's partner on the only gambling ship that hasn't burnt down. I'm not passing this up." And Holcomb says, "Yeah, I know. But the thing is, Brooks was into something big. Bigger than you, bigger than Berger. I just can't quite figure out what it was. I have all the puzzle pieces, but I can't figure out how they're put together. So I have to figure out how to make these puzzle pieces work for me." But Perry says that's not going to happen. This conversation gets really contentious until Holcomb collects himself and says, "Look, you want to make Brooks look bad, so do I. All I'm asking is that you come with me and see what I found." But Perry says, "No, I'm not going anywhere with you unless you give me something I can use." As this conversation is happening, Perry's apartment is once again getting broken into. Pete is trying to get into it, but Perry prepared for that, setting up a booby trap that really takes Pete's fingers out. I mean, they're pretty banged up. And also, one of Perry's neighbors ends up seeing him kind of lurking about, so Pete needs to get the hell out of there before the cops get called on him. He's not getting into Perry's apartment today. He's not going to be able to break into Perry's office that night because Della's there, until she gets a phone call from Camilla Nygaard asking her to come over. Della's a little surprised, but she does it. She heads over to see what Camilla wants, and Camilla's listening to some horrible music. But it's music that Della likes, so Camilla thought that maybe Della would appreciate it because Camilla has problems finding anybody who appreciates that crap. They start talking about the trial while Camilla smokes weed. They start talking about Perry and how the trial's been good for him. And then suddenly Camilla asks her, do you think I should fire Phipp, her attorney? Which, that question just comes out of the blue. Camilla says to Della that he's been distant lately. He acts like he isn't, but he is. Della doesn't really know what to say, even though Camilla says, I want your opinion. And Della tells her, from what I've seen, he appears to be pretty dedicated, and he also knows where the bodies are buried. Camilla then compliments Della, telling her that she's great to talk to, but swallows her drink, and hands the glass to Della and tells her, I want another one. Della awkwardly stands up to go get her one, but the entire interaction is weird. The next day, when Della and Perry get to the office, there's a gift for him. It's from Holcomb. It's the insurance that Perry requested, and it's a file from Sandhaven. It's the medical records for Noreen. And what the medical records say is that there's no way that what happened to Noreen and why she's in this state is because of a car accident. It was because she was choked and her brain was without oxygen for a long period. All this tracks because she has a mark on her neck. I mean, it looks like she was choked. As they're discussing the fact that while this file is nice, it's not exactly a smoking gun that they can use to get the boys off, there's a knock at the door, and it's Ginny Ames coming to visit them. He quickly introduces Ginny to Della, and Della mentions how Ginny looks like a snack. As Perry and Ginny go off to have dinner, Della continues to dive into the file, and she notices that Brooks McCutchen's belt looks an awful lot like the thing that would make the symbols on Noreen's neck. And that's probably because Brooks McCutchen has this fetish of choking women while having sex with them. Although nobody other than Brooks and the women who have had sex with him know this. He's into some kinky stuff we don't hate. But as Della burns the midnight oil, Perry goes on his date with Ginny. He discusses his relationship with Della, explaining that they've never hooked up. And while Perry doesn't say the reason why, he kind of just laughs off even the notion of it. And Ginny mentions the fact that she overheard Della say she looked delicious, which was a compliment. The date, though, goes really well, but the next day, Perry has to get ready for court again. And his first witness is Vincent Taylor, Noreen's brother. Perry starts weaving the tale together, pointing out that Vincent and Brooks knew each other. Brooks was actually a big contributor to Vincent's campaign. And then he catches Vincent in a lie when he brings up Noreen. Vincent says that what happened to her was a car accident. But the problem is, before he can truly point out that this is a lie, Della notices that he's losing most of the jurors. She suggests to Perry that she get up there and question Taylor. And it's a little unheard of because she doesn't have her law degree, but the judge allows it. So she starts getting up there and weaving together the story of what actually happened to Noreen. That Noreen worked in the same office as Brooks, that they hooked up, and that he choked her. And they have written testimony to women who have hooked up with Brooks McCutchen that he does like choking women with belts while having sex with them. And he doesn't stop until he feels like it. This whole line of questioning is very uncomfortable for Vincent. I mean, he's talking about his sister here. But he does have to admit that, yes, that is what happened. He did just lie on the stand. Noreen is in Sandhaven because Brooks McCutchen choked the hell out of her with a belt while hooking up with her, and now she's basically brain dead. That's the kind of guy that Brooks McCutchen was. None of it exonerates the boys, but it just makes Brooks McCutchen out to be a piece of crap that somebody would want to kill, i.e. like Vincent Taylor, for example. When court adjourns, Della is flying so high that the first thing she does is call up Anita and say, I'm moving in. She heads to the boarding house, apologizes to Hazel, and then leaves. But Della's not the only one who feels good about this situation. So do the brothers, especially Raphael. Mateo is more reserved on it, but Raphael thinks it's only a matter of time before they're acquitted. There's no way they can lose now. He's so chesty about it that he starts mouthing off to the police, and that gets him thrown in solitary. But this is a really, really bad look for the prosecution. All that Sandhaven stuff with Noreen, they weren't expecting any of that. Milligan's getting desperate, and he calls Pete into his office, and Pete says, look, man, I can't get into his place. I don't know what to tell you. Mason isn't an idiot. He knows somebody's onto him. So Milligan decides to play Pete a little bit, saying, well, if you think that Mason's smarter than you, then okay, that's fine. And then he walks out, and Pete's not about to let Perry Mason think that he's smarter than anybody. So Pete goes digging more. This time, he goes to his office, and he finds the gun. Now, normally Mason would be there, but after what Holcomb gave him, he decided to go to see what Holcomb was talking about when he came to his office and said, you got to come with me and see what I found. They head to the beach, but the beach isn't what Holcomb wanted to show Perry. It's to the side, near the rocks. He tells Mason that the McCutchen ships would get loaded up in Long Beach. When Brooks was alive, they would then head up towards the port of Santa Barbara. Brooks was paying people under the table to unload the produce there. He then got in cahoots with Goldstein, but he can't say anything about it because Goldstein's dead. After Goldstein died, that's when all the ships stopped going up there. Perry asks Holcomb, well, if they're not traveling up there, where are they going? And that's when they come across it. There's a ton of seagulls ravaging boxes of fruits and vegetables. It's as if somebody just dumped this stuff off. But the thing is, it's all covered in oil. And that is what Lydell has been covering up this whole time. When Perry shows Della, though, she asks, oh, okay, yeah, he's covering this up, but what is he covering up exactly? And Perry doesn't even know. He just knows that this is shady as hell. Perry vows to find out exactly what it is so that he can help the case, but Della suggests that they just rest. They've got the jury right where they want them. They've got plenty of reasonable doubt. If there was ever a time to rest, now would be it. But Perry wants to dig deeper. He wants to find out what Lydell is hiding. So they're going to keep going. Although the next day when they get to court, there's a bombshell that's dropped. Before they can even call the next witness or decide if they want to keep going or rest, Milligan tells the judge that they have reason to believe Perry is keeping the murder weapon in his office. Perry gets really, really nervous about this. He knows it's still there. He knows this is pretty damning. And the judge is not willing to let him talk to Della about what to do. I mean, Della was looking into whether or not it was legal because the boys didn't give them the weapon. It was Paul who found it. So it's a loophole in the system, but they don't know if it's a loophole enough to get them off. Needless to say, Perry is sweating bullets, especially when the judge decides to go for a little field trip to Perry's office. Perry is forced to go into his office, open the safe, and reveal the murder weapon. They're going to have to perform ballistics on the gun, but they're pretty sure that they're going to find out it was the murder weapon. They're not going to put Perry in contempt just yet, but the judge makes it clear that that still is on the table. Before the judge leaves, he says, you both will be in my chambers at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. And Milligan makes some snide comment of, let me know if you need the name of a good lawyer. All night, Perry and Della comb through books trying to find a situation like theirs that they can use to keep them out of jail, but also to keep this news out of the papers, and thus the boys out of the noose. Really, though, it's just Della doing this, because all Perry can think about is who betrayed him. He starts thinking about who overheard what, and he comes to the conclusion it must have been Ginny. She's only been in town for a couple years. Maybe she was playing him the whole time. I mean, she did overhear Della say that she looked delicious. So Perry leaves his office and heads right to Ginny's apartment. He's pretty confrontational about it, and Ginny doesn't really know where it's coming from. Perry ends up storming out of the place when Ginny acts like she doesn't know. But even though in the court it's going bad, Paul continues to stake out that corner. He's still replaying what happened to Ozzy over and over in his head. The fact that he beat the hell out of him. Especially when he sees a boy walking down the street wearing Ozzy's shoes. Paul gets really confrontational with the kid, asking where he got him. And the kid just knocked him off of a telephone pole, that's all. But Paul scares the crap out of him. So Paul is trying to focus, but it's that memory of beating on Ozzy that keeps replaying in his head. So it's making it a little difficult. Although, he finally gets a stroke of luck when a car, fitting the description of the one that Ozzy described, comes up to the corner. Paul quickly goes to follow it, And that's when that same boy with the Converse sneakers jumps out into the street, and Paul gets distracted. He jumps out of his car, he chases after the kid, but the kid gets away, and so does the car. And Paul's left in the middle of the street, empty-handed. In episode 7, Perry, Milligan, and the DA meet with the judge, and the judge doesn't quite know what to do because this situation is sort of unprecedented. He's leaning towards declaring a mistrial, which nobody in the room wants, including Perry. Ultimately, what he ends up doing is giving Berger and Milligan 2 days to write up a plan on why the gun should be admissible in court, and also what they plan to do about Perry, bringing charges against him for hiding evidence. Perry has to head back to the office pretty disappointed. He thinks he's going to be disbarred, and he gets a phone call from Pete. He agrees to meet Pete because, after all, they're friends, and they meet on a bridge, and Pete's just been feeling really, really guilty about what he did to Perry. Even though Milligan was paying him, he feels scuzzy about screwing over a friend like this. To make it worse, he doesn't like Milligan, and Milligan is reveling in the fact that he got one over on Perry. So he feels like he owes it to Perry to apologize. And when Perry realizes that it was Pete who was the one that broke into his office and broke into the safe, he immediately starts swinging haymakers at him. The two start getting into a fight right there on the bridge. Although it doesn't take long for cool heads to prevail because they both kind of gas out. Pete then asks Perry, all right, what are we going to do about this case? Because he's already been paid by Milligan. So now he's ready to help out his friend. But Perry looks at him and says, what do you mean, what are we going to do? The kids are going to be found guilty and I'm going to be disbarred and thrown in jail. I mean, I do have one Hail Mary, but it requires putting all these pieces together. But if I do that, then I'm going to take down some of the biggest names in the city. And Pete really likes the sound of that and turns to Perry and says, all right, well, then let's do it. Pete and Perry head back to the office where Della and Paul are waiting for them. But when Pete walks in the door, neither Della or Paul are happy to see him, especially Paul. He can't stand Strickland after what he did to him. And he doesn't want to work with this guy at all. He thinks he's a scumbag. And Della certainly doesn't want to work with Pete, especially after Perry reveals that it was Pete who was the one that gave the DA the gun. Doesn't matter, though. Perry's name is on the door, and he calls the shots. And he says, I don't care what you guys do with him after the case, but right now, we need Pete. So let's think about what we're going to do to keep these boys off of death row. They write down everything that they know and everything they need to look into. But one of the things that Della needs to look into is the state of her friend. She heads to Berger's office, who is ironically drafting up the report for the judge, and she just goes to check on him. Lately, Berger's been really distant, short, irritable, and he's been chalking it up to the fact that they're going against each other in court, but Della knows that it's a lot more than that. So she presses him to tell her what's going on, and he reveals to her that he's being blackmailed. Somebody sent him photos of him hooking up with another guy, and he doesn't know who this person is, but he knows it has to do with the Gallardo case, and that's why he gave Della the deal that he did, even though he felt like the case was pretty ironclad. Della wants to dive into it more, find out who this person is who's blackmailing him, and go after him. But the DA says, Della, don't do that. Don't get involved. Just accept defeat and fall back gracefully. Della, though, isn't about to let her friend get blackmailed. She just has to figure out a way to find out how to save him. Later that night, Pete and Perry head to the docks to check out one of the McCutchen ships, and it's being loaded up with a bunch of produce. But they're not the only ones who are checking out the ship. So is Holcomb from a distance. Holcomb tells them that the ship is targeted to go to some port in Japan. He doesn't know where, and he can't figure out what exactly is going on, but with Pete and Perry there, he's just going to pack it in for the night. Pete and Perry decide, you know what, we're going to find out what's going on with this ship. We're going to sneak onto the ship. We'll pretend to be deckhands, and no one will know any the wiser. And if the ship leaves, then we'll just steal a lifeboat and paddle back to shore. So the two blend in pretty seamlessly, and the ship does in fact leave a little while later, but Pete and Perry still don't have any answers, so they have to stay on it. But about an hour after the ship does leave, it comes to a stop, and that's when Pete and Perry get some answers, because some of the deckhands start throwing that produce that they loaded up into the ocean, while the other deckhands unload a lot of the oil into another ship that is right next to the McCutchen one. Pete and Perry have no idea how this is connected, what exactly is going on, but at least they have something to go off of. They also, though, realize that the lifeboats are way too big to steal, so they have to kind of jump into the ocean with a life preserver and paddle back the tough way. Now, what Perry and Pete don't know is that earlier in the day, Camilla Nygaard and Lydell McCutchen had a meeting with some representatives from Japan. The United States had just put some restrictions on selling to the Japanese. The Japanese have invaded a couple of allies of the U.S., and they're about to kick off World War II. These restrictions are only going to get worse and worse, and this is going to affect Lydell and Camilla's business, because the two are partners, even though they can't stand each other. Camilla kind of sabotages the meeting, getting up and speaking to the two representatives in Japanese, telling them that they really should set up their own shop in Japan so they don't have to worry about these under-the-table deals. And they agree to meet with Camilla later on. And Lydell hates the fact that he was just undercut. He kind of reprimands Camilla, but Camilla doesn't care. She actually crosses the line a little bit by bringing up the recent reports from court regarding Brooks and his sexual escapades. That's something that the press has latched onto quite a bit, and many papers have posed the question if Lydell knew about his son's weird ways. And it's unclear if he did, but what Lydell did know is that Brooks was kind of a screw-up. After Brooks announced that the baseball team was coming to LA at the Soup Kitchen, that was the final straw for Lydell. He booked Brooks a one-way ticket to Cuba and demanded that he get on the ship and leave town before he screwed up anything else. Lydell was aware that Brooks had recently gotten subpoenaed, and he was worried about what Brooks would say on the stand, and he doesn't want to take any chances. But Brooks got really tired of being labeled a screw-up. So he yells at his dad, "I did exactly what you told me to do. You told me to work on charitable efforts, and that's what I did. I took all that food that you were wasting, and I fed a city of hungry people with it. I mean, what's the government going to give me? A fine? But you have this illegal oil scheme going on. And I don't know any of that. I mean, my hands are clean of that. So I don't really think that I'm the screw-up in this situation." Later that night, Brooks was murdered. But Perry and Pete, they don't know any of this. They just head back to the office and start trying to put the pieces together. And it's actually Marion who helps them out by questioning if Lydell could be selling oil to the Japanese to fund the war. And that's when this whole case breaks open for Perry. It's like somebody turned the lights on. Lydell had this under-the-table business with the Japanese to sell them oil. He would fake it like his ships were going to Japan when in reality they weren't. But Brooks, taking that produce and feeding the homeless with it, was shining a light on Lydell's bigger scam. And he couldn't afford that. So if all this is true, it looks like Lydell McCutchen had his son murdered. With this eureka moment, Perry decided to go visit Lydell at his house and reveal everything that he knows about the case. He figures that he can use this to leverage Lydell to get his clients a better deal. But when he brings up Lydell having his own son murdered, Lydell gets in Perry's face saying, "I did nothing of the sort. I tried to save him." Every single allegation that Perry brought up to Lydell, he accepted. He didn't say a word. But the one allegation that he got upset about was this one. And it leaves Perry wondering if Lydell actually did have the trigger pulled. Now, the whole produce mess was something that Della dived into. She went to the USDA and she was trying to figure out what exactly they were investigating Brooks for. She knew that he was being investigated, and she knew that he was in business with Charlie Goldstein. She got a name for somebody at the USDA, and she went to go visit him, asking him questions. And that's where she learned that not only was Brooks being investigated, he, along with Charlie, were both subpoenaed. Although neither of them made the stand, they were both killed. Della asked the guy to see the file, and he went off to go see if he could show her, and he never came back. Some other guy entered the room, telling Della that the first guy wasn't coming back. And this second guy was really intimidating. But that man didn't work for the USDA. He worked for Camilla Nygaard. After he leaves the USDA office, he goes to visit Camilla, and he drops off some photos for her. Photos of Della, because that's the guy that's been following everybody around and keeping tabs on everybody. Of course, Perry has his own private investigator. It's Paul, and he's still trying to figure out who is in that blue car. He's doing one of his stakeouts, and Clara gets sick of it, so she decides to do it with him. And not too long after, the blue car shows up, and they follow it to a really nice, affluent neighborhood. They need to figure out a way, though, to find out who lives in that house. And Clara volunteers to go up, knock on the door, and pretend to be a Jehovah's Witness looking for donations. She does that, and the woman says for her to come in, but when Clara walks inside, the woman has a needle in her arm, and then she starts foaming at the mouth. Clara doesn't quite know what to do, and that's when the woman's husband comes home. This causes Clara to go hide in the closet so she's not found. But the woman's husband isn't just anybody. It's Phipps, Camilla Nygaard's attorney. As he is calling the police and the ambulance to come save his wife, Clara grabs a piece of mail so that Paul can get a name and sneaks out the back door. So the pieces are starting to come together. And then finally, a little bit of an update on the brothers. While Raphael is still in the hole, Mateo is visited by their mother, and she's got great news. Raphael has made art school. She leaves it up to Mateo whether or not to tell him once he gets out of solitary confinement. And in the season finale, Perry tells Della all about the fact that it's actually Camilla Nygaard pulling the strings. And Della is in complete denial. She just can't believe that her so-called friend would do that. In the middle of their argument, Paul comes in with the piece of mail that Clara snagged from Phipps's house, and at that point, Della kind of has to believe it. Perry wants to take all this information to Berger because the judge is ruling the next day, but she says, "You can't. He won't work with us. He's being blackmailed." And now we all know who by. Della is pretty hesitant to tell everybody what the blackmail revolves around, but she does, having everybody swear that they won't let it leave the room. The next day, Perry heads to the courthouse, but he actually meets with the judge. He wants to get a sense of which way he's ruling, and the judge doesn't give him any information. Perry makes the plea to the judge that to give the boys a public defender wouldn't be fair. It's not like Perry wants to be completely scot-free from this. He knows that he should have some kind of punishment, but he wants to stay on as the boys' lawyer. And the judge kind of gives him a side-eye and then walks off. A short while later, everybody meets in the judge's chambers, and he admits that he was prepared to declare a mistrial. But he's reconsidered. The trial will continue. The gun will be admissible, but with no mention of how it was obtained. Because they don't want to give the location of where they found the gun, they're going to tell everybody that it was found in the Hooverville that the boys lived in. Once the trial is finally concluded, Perry's going to jail for 4 months. When they walk out of the judge's chambers, Della is shocked that Perry just gave into that so easily. She thinks that 4 months is really tough, but Perry reassures her, "Della, it's fine. This will buy us some time to get those pictures that Nygaard has on Berger." And in order to get those pictures, they're going to need Phipps's help, so they head to his house, where he's dealing with his wife, who is going through withdrawal. Della, Perry, and Paul sneak into his house, and they call for him. They tell him that they know it was him, they have all this information, and he folds like a cheap suit. Perry tells him, "We don't want to get you in trouble. We want your help. Help us get those pictures." And Camilla's sense about Phipps was right. He hasn't really been liking working for her. So he kind of jumps at this opportunity, figuring that if Camilla Nygaard goes down, he's not going to have a job anyway, so what does it matter? He's able to sneak over to her place, grab all of the photos, and while he's almost caught, he's not. He's able to get out of there with all the goods. Everything Camilla Nygaard has on just about anybody, which is a lot of pics. He wants to give it to Perry, but the next day is the final day in court. The prosecution points out that they found the gun, where they found it. They make their closing statements, and now it's up to the jury. When Perry gets back from court, he has a note waiting for him from Phipps saying, "I have the goods, we need to meet." The two meet up on the side of the street. Phipps gives him everything he's got. And when Perry gets back to the office, Della and him comb through it all, and they notice that there are some familiar faces in these photos. Themselves. Nygaard had pics of Perry on a horse with Teddy. He's got pics of Della with Anita at the boxing match. These two realize just how much dirt Camilla Nygaard had on the entire town. So the next day, they take all the pics of Berger to him, saying, "Here's everything. The pics, but also the negatives." Then they also hand over all the information that points to Camilla Nygaard being the puppet master in the Brooks McCutchen murder. Berger tells them that he is thankful for what they did, truly. But this entire city has been reminded of this murder every day from the newspapers and from the radio. He just can't let the boys walk. Somebody did kill Brooks McCutchen. Somebody pulled the trigger. So they come to a plea deal. They go back and forth, but what Perry accepts is that Mateo Gallardo will agree to plead guilty. In return, he's going to get 30 years, but no parole. Rafael Gallardo, he's going to walk. Ultimately, it is the boys' decision, so Perry and Della take the decision to both Mateo and Rafael, and Mateo agrees to it. He knows how difficult this is going to be because he has a young wife and a young child, but he's also giving his brother hope for a future. Perry and Della then tell Berger the news that they've accepted the plea deal, and Berger does something that he really enjoys, firing Milligan. Berger didn't really like the way that Milligan found the gun. He also hasn't really liked the way that he's conducted himself. Really cocky, really arrogant. So he enjoys telling him that they reached a plea deal. And Milligan can't understand why they would do that. He feels like he completely won this case. But as Berger reminds him, you don't have to understand it. You're not the DA. I am. The next day at court, the judge announced to everybody that a plea deal has been reached. Mateo Gallardo stands up. He apologizes to the family of Brooks McCutchen. And then he is sent away to San Quentin. Rafael is freed. Both Perry and Berger meet the media outside. Berger makes the statement that justice was served, and it seems like a win-win for everybody. Everybody except Mateo Gallardo, but then again, he did shoot and kill somebody. Perry even says that it doesn't seem like a loss. Seems like he got the best deal for his client. And he gives all the credit in the world to Della, saying that she was the real rock star in this case. And the press has really latched on to Della. But they've also noticed something, that she's been out and about with Hamilton Berger. The press assumes that the two are dating. And Della doesn't dispel these myths at all, because she wants to keep their sexuality a secret. Now, while Perry didn't thank him publicly in the press, he goes over privately to thank Paul. But Paul lets him know that that'll be the last case he's working for Perry. This current one just did a number on him. He risked way too much for just simply not enough. What he's going to do is now go work for Melville Perkins. Perkins was impressed with the fact that Paul kept his word. He stayed away when Perkins was going through his trial. And he decided that he needed a guy that was loyal, true to his word, and had Paul's certain set of skills. What he wants to do is build a park and a pool in the African-American community. But in order to do that, he's going to need some bigwigs downtown to agree to it. And that means finding dirt on them. So he's going to hire Paul to go to city councilmen and dig up any information he can that they can use to better their own community. That night, Perry and Della celebrate. They're celebrating the quasi-win, but they're also celebrating Perry's last night out, because the next day he has to head to jail. The next day, though, before he does head off to the Tink, he has to make amends with somebody, Ginny Ames. He goes to the stables, he apologizes, he explained what happened, and he tells her that he's going to be gone for a while because, he's a bad boy. He's off to prison. And to his surprise, she asks, well, how long are you out? Because even after that little blow-up, Ginny still wants herself a little Perry Mason. Perry then heads to the courthouse, and Pete goes with him. Pete does give him some good advice. Don't tell anyone you're a lawyer. You're going to have everybody who claims they're innocent at your cell wanting you to look at their case. Just lay low and get through it in 4 months. You'll be all right. Perry's then processed. He gets his cell, and he hunkers down for the next 4 months. As for Della, she went to go visit Camilla Nygaard. She wanted to tell her off, because she really looked up to Camilla, a single woman who had made herself a powerhouse in the city of Los Angeles. But it turns out the way she was doing things was dirty and criminal. Camilla tries to defend her actions, but Della ain't having it. And she also didn't come alone. It wasn't like Berger was just going to let Camilla Nygaard get off scot-free. So she ends up getting arrested. As for Lydell, well, he had some criminal activity, but he was smart about it. He fled to Japan. And he's not going to be coming back for a long, long time. As for Holcomb, he ended up burning that boat. It was a money pit anyway. But this story does end on a happy note. Rafael Gallardo got into art school, and he's thriving. And that's the end of Perry Mason Season 2. Thank you so much for getting this part of the recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit thumbs up if you like this recap. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. Let me know if you think there's going to be a season 3. I sure hope so, but then again, I don't know anyone who watches this show other than me. Be nice in the comments section, and if you're feeling like it, I do have merch and a Patreon and, a bunch of other different ways you can give me money to show support for the channel.